So we're not as well organized as ants and bees, but we coalesce into networks, or we're conscripted into them. Many of the networks that we've relied on to connect us to one another are also stressed out, or they're broken, or they're asymmetric. And many of the delivery systems for our basic needs have no assurance of surviving or working forever. So partly because of this, but also for other reasons, fear and anxiety play a big role in our lives and work. And as an archivist, I'm extremely quite aware how much archival work is motivated by anxiety. And I've suggested other times and places that we try to transition away from anxiety towards celebration and performance. And asymmetry also engenders anxiety. And we quickly start talking asymmetry when we talk about power. More about that later. Okay, yeah, that's good. But on to networks, yeah. Probably the less light we have in front of the screen, the better. Thank you. But on to networks. Isn't this beautiful needlepoint? I don't know if you can see that there, but that's industrial needlepoint. The networks came to meet us and we joined them. They offered power, water, mobility, and communication. They promised interdependence between makers and consumers, workers and companies, resources and users, people in the state, near and far. Some of the networks had instability embedded in them from the start.
Now, in one lifespan, the future came rushing in like an avalanche. Here was power. Unbelievably versatile power, titanically muscle power, leaping to any task, incredibly delicate power, responding with instant precision to the tiniest signal, hot power melting and fusing metals, or gently warming a sleeping child. Magic power soaring through space to link man with man. Brilliant power lighting the way to a better world. Above all, here was power for freedom, power to expand existing freedom, power to create new freedom. Add new freedom to enjoy contact with the wider world and all it has to offer. Greater freedom for social contact, new freedom of the mind. And a revolutionary new freedom, freedom from drudgery.
That clip celebrates a transition from scarcity to abundance in the late 1940s. It doesn't so much talk about the grid, but about inputs to the grid. And it assumes that the inputs don't stop. In other words, that the juice will keep flowing. I grew up, like many of us, never questioning the inevitability of electricity. I thought power mostly came from water turbines. I never thought much about oil and coal. And even after the great Northeast blackout of 1965, I thought that power failures were exciting interruptions in a continuum of abundance. I no longer do. Already many people experience a live outlet as an exception rather than a rule. And in other areas, overabundance or uneven distribution of other resources were already a problem.
For the water comes downhill, spring and fall, down from the cut-over mountain, down from the plowed also. From as far west as Idaho, and as far east as Pennsylvania. Down every brook and rill, rivulet and creek. Carrying every drop of water that flows down 2/3 of the continent. 1903, 1907, 1913, 1916, 1922, 1927, 1936, 1937. Down from Pennsylvania Pennsylvania and Ohio, Kentucky and West Virginia, Missouri and Illinois, down from North Carolina and Tennessee, down the Judith, the Grand, the Osage and the Platte, the Rock, the Salt, the Black in Minnesota, down the Monongahela, the Allegheny, Kanawha and Muskingum, the Miami, the Wabash, the Licking and the Green, the White, the Wolf, the Cass and the Black, down the Corn, Kaskaskia, the Red and Yazoo, down the Cumberland, Kentucky and the Tennessee, down the Ohio 1,000 miles from Pittsburgh, down the Arkansas 1,000 miles from Texas, down to the Mississippi.
Recognize that clip is from Per Lorentz's somewhat experimental, somewhat documentary film, The River, 1938, funded by the U.S. government, freaked Congress out. Of course, in those days, you could talk, there was room in the discourse for kind of to build a poetics around natural disasters. I'm not sure there is anymore after Katrina, but it takes a lot of work to build a landscape and to manage or to decide not to manage the relationships that occur in the landscape, which is of course itself a social relation. As a toddler, I walked holding my mom's hand as she pushed the carriage with my baby sister along Rockville Pike. We lived in a suburb that was developing so quickly its infrastructure could not keep up with demand. The main drag was a 2-lane rural road with narrow, loamy shoulders on the side of the broken asphalt. It was a decade after World War II, but it was impossible to get a phone in the exploding suburbs, even as much as it had been during the war. So baby boomers have seen the telephone escape scarcity, move toward abundance, and in recent years, actually, irrelevance. It's only a survivalist impulse that keeps me renting a landline month to month. The wired communications infrastructure built with copper wire is losing customers fast. It's being edged out by fiber that can also carry, TV. What else could we use the landline network for before we lose it? Redundancy, maybe? An alternative to unstable and potentially unhealthy wireless? Could there be landline jacks in public places? Could there be a cell phone that you could also plug into the wall? I'd actually love to see that with a little wire. Telephones.
Long distance. Long distance. Long distance.
Millions of times every day in America, a voice on a wire briefly and simply identifies itself in 2 words: long distance. These words form one of the most familiar phrases of our language. It is a phrase that announces an unseen personality, an alert young woman who needs to know only who or where in order to make a path for speech to town or countryside over the horizon. It suggests naturally a watchful feminine presence at a switchboard and the supplementary agency that in a few seconds can select from countless routes the one that best can take this speech to faraway places. Long distance means many things: waves, wires, antennas, buildings, many arts, many skills, many functions. A composite instrumentality ready for the task ahead. And giving this instrumentality life and energy is the spirit that moves men and women everywhere who undertake the duties of communication. It is the spirit that fights the storm and keeps the wires working, come sleet or snow or hurricane or flood. It is the spirit that speeds, in routine or emergency alike, the words that question, that answer, that decide, that summon aid or give it. It is the age-old tradition of the message bearer.
Long distance. Long distance.
It's such a tremendously, elegant film. It's really worth looking at the complete version online. They don't make movies like that anymore. Where you track in along the operators, and at the end you come back out again. It's quite beautiful, and it's fairly deep. While engineers were already working, that's 1941 more or less. Engineers were already working on concepts for a completely automated, customer-dialed long-distance system. But women were still needed to implement the actual connections. And this film makes peace with that necessity. And it characterizes humans as key network switching points. Not that it was a great place to work, but it's a relatively respectful film. And not included in what I showed, but in the rest of the film, is a whole narrative of territorial expansion, of manifest destiny. It's too long to show you today about how the build-out of the network was enabled by the European takeover of our continent. The one thing I want to say about the phone is, we think that the internet is the greatest and the most disruptive invention that ever happened and the greatest change. I don't know if it really is, but I'm not even sure how it rates next to the telephone. Because if you think of the dramatic isolation in which many people and families lived prior to, the 50s or the 60s, the telephone was tremendously significant. This notion of relatively mediated communication, even if you didn't have one down at the drugstore, there was the possibility of reaching somebody in an emergency, whatever. I think it's a tremendous, dramatic shifter of human experience. Let's talk about cars. This is Medford, Massachusetts. It's about 1938. This is a stunt, to raise money, and basically people are burning jalopies. I guess this happened all over the country in the 30s. Fortunately, we don't have the fire. So we've always questioned the car. I think one day, somebody will put the histories of the car and the internet together. At first, like the net, automobiles triggered the most polarized and extreme arguments. Cars introduced unwelcome, speeding objects that were bigger than people and killed people into the landscape. On top of that, they were unreliable. As people would yell, "Get a horse." There was fear that distances that the automobile could bridge brought on too much disintermediation. While the farmer could go directly to market, there was also all sorts of fear that the automobile was killing the values of rural life, the imagined values. In the 1920s, adults wasted a lot of newsprint worrying that the privacy and the mobility of the car enabled youth to slip away from adult supervision and have sex. And today there's a whole new critique of cars. You know it better than I do. It seems to us to be perfectly reality-based, but I'd love to know how we look at it in 50 or 100 years. Most of us, you know, when we think about mobility, most of us are pretty peripatetic now. The airplanes have never been so full, but you know, automobiles driven are down from last year, and younger people are driving less. You notice, you've probably seen this, people aren't getting their licenses till they're 18 or older. This to me is completely unimaginable. I wanted to get out of the house, you know, when I was 12. Gas prices, possible decreasing engagement with automobiles, with car culture, loss of job mobility, these could all be factors. And I'm really interested in how certain ideologies are going to hold up in the next few years. The ideology of freedom of movement, the ability to pick up and go, to escape, the endless frontier. Makes you think of, if we think of shrinking mobility, you begin to wonder about localism. Is localism, you know, a positive choice, or is it also a consequence of shrinking horizons? And, you know, how will North Americans deal with shrinking horizons? I don't think we deal very well with disappointment in this country. So this has pushed me into making a film, and I'm going to show a few clips from it and talk about some of these issues embedded in people's home movies of driving and travel. Are a whole bunch of really kind of complicated and wonderfully exciting narratives and ideas. You know, the people tended to shoot home movies about things they loved or about things they were proud of, things they wanted to show off. And it's really astonishing to me how much of people's home movies, how much of it takes place on the road, and how much of it is actually shot out of the window. This view, you know, which is of course one of the things that's subjectively incredibly attractive, you know, navigating the road network, with moving through the landscape. So much of that is photographed. I just had to leave this in because it's camping in 1932, and these people are hedging their bets, because if you look at up here, we see pictures both of Hoover and Roosevelt, the two candidates. I mean, my God. Romney and Obama, take them camping with you. Home movies from an African-American family from Omaha, Nebraska, and this is roadside scenes of Appalachia about 1932. Movies of the kind of devastated landscape of southern Ohio in 1931, the Black Cat Tavern, a bank which puts its financial statement on the front window to reassure people during the Depression. But these are people navigating the road network and choosing to take these particular scenes. And I want to understand why they shot what they did, and put it together into a film that may attempt to find the future in the past, but also the past in the future. This is downtown Detroit in the early 60s. This is somewhere in Texas. This was a guy with a kind of an odd frame of mind, because here he is, and you may recognize the grassy knoll. This, you could argue, this influenced Ant Farm, but of course it didn't. In January or February 1964, he goes to Dallas, and he does his own revisiting and reenactment, because he actually drives the route of the limousine through Dealey Plaza and under the Triple Underpass. I mean, you would imagine people would do this now, but doing it in January of '64, that's some pretty intense kind of, you know, media freaking. And so on. Another clip.
Over broad highways made by and made for the automobile, what Americans have produced comes back to serve Americans. So it is that we can live in the country, work in the city. Life in America has changed. So it is that we can make our living on a farm and have a home in town. So it is that we can live where we want to. The shopping centers now come out to meet us. The ever-expanding involvement of people takes on a new dimension, the great new dimension of interrelated use.
That was, the pictures are from 1955, but the words are from 1951. Community and interdependence. That clip introduced. What examples are there in the past or maybe elsewhere on Earth that might inspire us in a positive or negative way? You know, we could, of course, look to plants and animals so as to better understand community. That's kind of an aside, but I wanted to show an example of an odd but strangely touching film. I'm showing a small community that is a dense network of reciprocal ties. This is a historical recreation of life in the Naumkeag colony, which became Salem, Massachusetts, 1626 to 1629.
Over at the fox dugout nearby, morning tasks are likewise underway. Mr. Fox is hewing newly felled fir. That's something that has to be done in carving a home out of a wilderness. Lucinda Fox is grinding Indian corn, a food important to all the settlers, while Brother Oliver milks the family goat, a highly prized possession brought from England. And now, Jason has laid the new fire and must borrow a live ember to light it. Here he is at the Fox place.
Would there be an ember in your fire for some careless bachelors, John?
That there would, Jason, and you'll be welcome. Do but speak of it to Susan. The Naumkeag settlers share dangers together, and they gladly share comforts too.
How seems Master Robert today, Mistress Fox?
I fear me there is little change. The fever has not left him these many days.
One day, when you're well again, laddie, you can hunt deer with Jason.
The fireplace doesn't always give adequate heat, especially when there is sickness in the house. Sickness that may be very serious. In the gardens of the settlement, medicinal herbs are grown, some of local origin and others transplanted from England. Mistress Lane, who is skilled in their preparation and use, supervises a selection to be used in a special broth. Later, she carries her preparation to a case of serious illness in the home of Harold Perry.
Here is a draught of herbs, fresh brewed for Mistress Perry.
'Tis most hearty and welcome, for the taint is still sharp.
Yes, there is still sickness, and there is still the helpfulness of neighbor toward neighbor. There has to be in a new land where the settlers face the uncertainties of a new way of life. Mistress Perry knows that building a better world requires courage and faith. And these men writing back to England, they know that too.
We are sorry to send back the ship without better lading, but there be much sickness among us, and many of our number lack strength to survive the winter's cold. Yet, for the most, we remain of good heart and make what haste we can to build our plantation. Among our number there be those of divers motives, some mainly prizing liberty of conscience, and some chiefly seeking worldly gain. Yet we form one body politic, joined by common consent.
So, of course, this community of common consent excludes the Native Americans who were there before. Another community, this is Pittsburgh in the late 1930s. If any of you know Pittsburgh, this is, people think that this is a neighborhood called the Hill, which was largely redeveloped. And, you know, this material has sort of considerable value as documentation. It's pretty fascinating what it shows. But I also, you know, when you read it as kind of rare documentation of a lost ethnic urban community, to me, it really makes me think about urban communities and different ethnic and national communities in the United States, especially New Americans. And And I cannot see this material without thinking of the present. So to me, it really prefigures something which, you know, we can only imperfectly. Do you notice there's leeches for sale behind the streetcar and the drugstore there? You know, traditional remedies. But to me, this very much prefigures the present. You know, I never think of historical material as simply being documentation of something that's gone. I tend to also think of it as potentially predictive, or, you know, some people might say proleptic, that it anticipates, you know, it opens up a parenthesis which can only be completed in the present. It's really, if there's any archivists in the audience, it's super unusual to find 16mm material that was probably shot by working people or working poor people in that period, because it cost $2 a minute, which is equivalent to about $35 to $40 today to photograph and to process 16mm. And, you know, the nice thing, of course, about this kind of evidence is that we can all be ethnographers for 2 minutes instead of our whole lives. So, you know, another realm of interdependence which we've been hearing about since the birth of industrial society is the relationship between workers and owners. It seems simple to describe, and in other ways it isn't simple at all. Arguably, there was some sort of interdependency, a network of interdependency that existed for a time. Some people call it the social contract, until globalized economic relations and debt rode over most existing economic relationships. This network, of course, is broken down, and relations between workers and owners are in flux, but so far most of the pushback has been down instead of up. This is how it looked in 1937. I should say that this next film clip was made after the organization of the United Auto Workers. It was made to demonstrate that even though we had a union, that workers and their company were interdependent, and I should say codependent, actually.
And now a stream of paychecks flows to all the men who are building 1 million cars for the boulevards and highways of America. Tens of thousands of men on one single payroll have money for themselves and for their families to spend. Money to spend for wholesome foods, for good clothes, money for comforts and conveniences. Fresh buying power floods into all the stores of every community. New trade and new commerce have been created by the overflow of purses. And beyond the marketplaces, new wealth flourishes and new prosperity grows. Prosperity greater than history has ever known.
The existence of networks implies interdependence, but in practice, networks often enable asymmetric dependency. I don't need to tell you this, but the details of our movements, our consumer behavior, our online lives are accessible to corporations and the government, but the details of most corporate and government activity are not open to us. We didn't give permission for many of these networks to exist. We didn't write the contracts governing our involvement. There was no opting in, and there's no opting out. Another example, the historian Edward P. Thompson writes about how time itself changed for working people with the advent of industry. Originally, people's sense of time came from the rhythms of day and night, sun and moon, especially those who worked the land. But when groups and masses of workers were corralled into factories, this necessitated a system of regulation that required quantifying time, and clocks entered the lives of ordinary people and began to integrate them into a system of involuntary interdependence. I found this film, and it's not about people, but it's about the same idea, and it's so creepily elegant, I have to show you. It's a film called Get Going, about like power, from 1938, I think. Also in flux is the complex of relations between people in the state. A lot of oppositional modes have developed in the last few generations. I think many of them are embryonic in this country, and we have to say that those of us who don't yet feel the iron hand often try to ignore it as if it wasn't there. The state doesn't like autonomous networks of production and communication over which it has no regulatory or political control. Governments don't like the internet. Governments and their corporate masters are getting ready to hate 3D printing, big time. So the state enables some networks, destroys others. And with that in mind, let's go back 70 years and look at a more benevolent formulation of the relationship between the state and the people. This is a clip from a film called Tuesday in November, made in 1945 by John Houseman.
Good morning, everybody.
I'm like your very first one, right on the dot.
Always like to vote early. Gives Republicans a temporary lead. Here's your ballot. Thanks.
That's as far as we can go. Remember, this is a secret vote. No one ever sees another person mark his ballot. It's not only here in Riverton that the voting is heavy today. All over the country, people are conscious of the momentous issues facing their nation and the world. This is their way of expressing their conviction of how and by whom these issues should be met. The two major presidential candidates vote like all the other citizens. One of them in New York City describes himself as a lawyer. The other, up in the country where his home is, gives his occupation as farmer. All over the country, week after week, 140 million citizens take part in the great debate. Business, professional, and civic groups endorse one candidate or the other. first time in American history, organized labor takes an active part in the campaign. Now the election board begins its last duty, the counting of the votes. The figures are checked and double-checked. Then they are telephoned to headquarters.
Hello? This is Mrs. Dawson, 7th Precinct. Ready to report.
From coast to coast, precinct by precinct, city by city, state by state, the results are recorded. All over America tonight, the people are waiting to learn whom they have chosen to govern them for the next 4 years. Towards midnight, the final results are announced. A nation of 140 million has elected a government.
You know, I show this not to draw some kind of a line between idealism and realism, or between propaganda and real life, but to recall the incredible sophistication of the network that coordinated voting, that counted votes and reported election results to the public. And I think what this film is trying to say, in a way similar to the way people talk about the internet today, the network effect enables the network effect enables democracy. They're trying to say, in this case, that scale worked in the United States, that 140 million people could elect a government during the war. But here's the state talking to people 30 years later in 1975.
I think it's going to end with everybody changing their habits and going back to the things that maybe our parents were used to that we have never seen before.
Just start working now, otherwise we won't have time. We're going to be out of oil within a few years.
People say, well, it's not going to run out in our time. We have to think of our kids and our kids' kids and how they're going to have to put up with a whole lot of stuff just because we're not careful.
If we're going to have the energy we need. If we want new oil, we've got to look in new places. We must demand more efficient engines for our cars. We must push forward, at whatever cost, the development of new energy resources. We must make personal commitments to cut down wherever we can on the energy we use. Only this can keep the total energy circuit from breaking disastrously for all of us. The energy is here, within this universe, on this planet. It's a challenge facing each of us in all lands, to explore, to find, to develop, and to use wisely, not wastefully, the energy that's here. If we meet this challenge, it will be for the good of all mankind on Earth.
So space imagery, you know, for all mankind. I mean, this is 37 years ago, and the new geopolitics of energy is unfolding every day. Natural gas production is up with fracking. Amazing article today in the Times about oil exploration in the Arctic, and the Russians have very nice military maps of the U.S. already. I'm not, trying to go Cold War on you right now. I think most of us wouldn't even really understand the deeper and less manifest strains of literacy and community until they truly disappeared. We tend to eternalize the present. We imagine that Google, Apple, or Facebook will be iconic brand names for 1,000 years. We look to both past and future to confirm our understanding of the present. So I want to end with a few words about pioneering, which is deeply embedded in this conference. Pioneering is indeed 21st century radical traditionalism. I've heard that this is a very active discussion in Detroit, and a Detroiter that I saw in a movie drew a distinction between pioneers who are nomadic and settlers who grow roots. There's also the question of settlement versus secession. The West is filled with people looking for places where they can avoid other people. Today, networks offer us the opportunity to be itinerant pioneers, floating pirates, nomadic journey persons. These are hybrid roles, these are exciting roles, but I'm not yet sure how much they constitute a departure from tradition. Putting together this talk has almost convinced me that we're destined to make the same kinds of communities over and over again, though their appearances may be different and they may be populated by, gender-bending post-humans. But I think the communities may remain much the same. And it's also got me thinking about the pluses and minuses of isolation, which I think is a tremendous issue. I don't mean sitting in front of the glowing rectangle. I mean physical isolation. Here's another historical recreation I think points to that.
Mom, see them campers over there?
I think we ought to take something to them.
It is lonely on the plains in 1870, very lonely. News from back east is always welcome. To settlers like the Crawfords, a visit to a newcomer is to relive their own journey west, and to foresee needs and emergencies that will confront oncoming pioneers. Strangers in all but their sharing of a common heritage and a common destiny, established settlers and new arrivals greet each other with warmth and genuine friendship.
We saw your camp from the house and kind of wanted to come over and talk. It's awful lonesome out here.
Glad you came. Come over and sit down.
Yes, it is good to be with one's own kind again.
Where are you from?
Illinois.
How long have you been on the way?
About 8 weeks now.
Yes, my husband filed his claim last spring and came back for the children and me in July.
You'll find things very different out here.
Yes, I imagine we will.
So friendly talk goes on around the Carter campfire until, with the setting of the sun over the darkening prairie vastness, there comes a request for music. Music that erases the solitude of the plains.
We'll stop that. I'm one of those who thinks that the real fresh start is going to take us off the earth, and sooner or later, as some writers speculate, the affairs of Earth and extraterrestrial settlements will become inextricably entwined in the same way that the affairs of former colonies tend to come back to haunt the former mother country.
Cupelon, deposited on the site of the New York World's Fair on September 23, 1938, by the Westinghouse Electric and Manufacturing Company. If anyone should come upon this capsule before the year AD 6939, let him not wantonly disturb it, for to do so would be to deprive the people of that era of the legacy here left them. Cherish it, therefore, in a safe place.
5,000 years from now, the peoples of the future will look back on us as we look back on the early Egyptians and Babylonians.
I think our future will be communitarian, but some flavor. I don't know what. Many of us agree. But right now we're collectively fairly confused. Some individuals in the audience may have gotten over their confusion. But most of us are fairly confused as to what we want from this potentially utopian age and how we might want to make it happen. So I'd like to end by suggesting that in the midst of the pervasive networks that encase us, there are many emptier places that could use some attention. And I know we're talking about the West, but I've chosen to end with just a little bit of video from Michigan City, Indiana. this took longer than I wanted it to, but I don't know if we have to give the room up, but if anybody has questions or would like to say something. Yes? Well, I think on behalf of I think on behalf of corporations who rely on patent law and copyright law to protect their market positions, I think we're going to see a massive legal offense against unregulated, or a massive offensive to regulate 3D printing in the next few years. It's just so incredibly disruptive.
How do you know that, or is that your guess?
I don't have special knowledge. No, it's my prediction. I think it's far more disruptive than, I mean, you know, it is true that the entertainment industry is our second biggest export or whatever, but maybe our first now. But I just see 3D printing as being so incredibly disruptive in a million ways. I mean, you can print your own eyeglasses. You know, it's going to have massive effects on both large and small business, and I just don't think it's going to go through unregulated. You could do so many. What means you can replicate high value items. Items that it's not like Xeroxing, you know, an article out of a magazine. This is far more disruptive. If you can print your own. Well, I just saw a really amazing video. I mean, it was filled with all this sort of bizarre stuff about nature, but where they 3D printed a new beak for a bald eagle, whose beak had been shot off. You know, that's something that would normally cost a tremendous amount of money to do. And when you can 3D print, you know, a new hip joint or something like that, this is going to be, I think, tremendously disruptive. Just a guess. Yeah. Printing a 3D printer, right? The self-replicating machine. Can it print a 3D printer that can put itself together, though? Complete. Yeah, Aaron.
So you were talking about the growth in networks that exist and the stagnation of certain networks. That's pretty easy to see in this day and age, depending on these machines that are breaking down. And it seems like you're also calling for, you know, DIY networks and full networks. What models exist out there, either in nature or on a human level, that you think we could do?
There are a million models, and a lot of people are talking about that here. I guess, you know, I'm a historian without a diploma, so my particular angle is just don't imagine that you've discovered something for the first time, and look to history and to, I think, you know, to the natural world for models. That's really, you know, that's what I do best. I love the DIY movement. You know, I mean, you know, Maker Faire is probably the one corporate initiative that's least corrupted of anything. Although I know people talk about DARPA and all that kind of stuff, but there's a million models, and it's one of the reasons this has never been a more exciting time to live, despite the dystopian overtones. Yes.
Well, first of all, as a filmmaker, I want to thank you for your archive. I mean, it's...
Can I just interrupt and say that it's getting better. It's on its way to doubling the online collection, and plus there's going to be 3,000 or 4,000 home movies up by the end of next year.
Thank you again for that. I guess everyone knows what a great thing that you've done for independent filmmakers. I'd actually be curious to know how you're able to double your archive. But I also had a question about Julian Assange, since you're both in the information business. If you had any thoughts on what he's doing?
On Julian Assange?
Yeah, or what's been happening related to that?
You know, I don't have anything particularly original to say. Sometimes people who do amazing things aren't necessarily the nicest people. But you know, symbolically, that's been an astonishing attack on the authority and secrecy of the state. And you know, all you need to know to gauge that is to look at the at the treatment that that you know Bradley, who would prefer to be known as Brianna Manning, has endured. They want to make sure nobody else is going to do that, and it's actually quite astonishing. What is it? 1 out of 80 people in the United States, it's either one out, I just calculated this recently and I put it in a tweet and then forgot it, but 1 out of 64, 1 out of 80 people in the United States has a top secret clearance. That ratio is greater than the number of East Germans who are actively employed by the Stasi. And people aren't leaking the security state. Most of that information is remaining closed, and so I think at least, you know, symbolically and certainly in the international level, that's quite a thing. It isn't just him. You know, WikiLeaks is a few other key people and a lot of other folks as well. Is that helpful? That's not much of an answer. Sort of conventional wisdom.
Have you ever had documents offered to you to put on your archive? And, you know,
at the Internet Archive?
Yeah.
I mean, people can post, anybody can post anything to the Internet Archive, and it really almost never gets taken down. The only reason stuff gets taken down from the Internet Archive, I can think of 2 or 3 reasons. Number one, if a legitimate copyright holder files a DMCA takedown, and then we have to take it down. Or if some, you know, there's a lot of jihadi videos on the Internet Archive, and Internet Archive has been taking down stuff that it discovers with explicit bomb-making instructions, and I think that some assassination material has been taken down. But we're, you know, speaking as a board member, Internet Archive is a library, and so generally it tries not to be too judgmental. I have no knowledge. I don't think people have tried to leak us, you know, top secret documents. I haven't heard about it. Yeah?
You talked about the problems of the DIY movement and others who organize and using the internet, and the fact that it's a kind of a government-sponsored network, and you don't have full control, power over it.
Corporate control.
And corporate control. How do you feel about the sort of notion of sort of organizing sub-networks and kind of subversively using networks like the internet or the telephone network or any of the other kind of too big to take down easily networks?
I think it's really an excellent idea. We need our own internet, and we need many internets that interoperate. You know, the internet is great to root around damage, as Gilmore or whoever said that, but right now it is a single point of failure, especially if you're an activist. Potentially a single point of failure, for sure. You know, I'm going to be around today and tomorrow, and thank you all so much for coming and sitting through this long, and yeah, I hope to meet you all later.